Tonight I saw a screening of a movie called Supernova, the Music Festival Massacre. And I just wanted to talk about it. I took some notes here. It was very reminiscent of the compilation of the massacre footage of October 7th that I saw in November that was brought here from the IDF. And a lot of the story in this documentary, actually all of the story, was told first person from either the survivors of the massacre or from the video footage of the Hamas terrorists. And a lot of the footage, well, some of the footage was actually the same footage that the IDF collected. But what was different about this documentary is that it focused only on the Supernova Music Festival, in which 370 concert goers were killed. What's interesting is that they didn't know the scope of what had happened until afterwards. In total, about 1,200 people were killed. And initially they thought this was like the main massacre, but they say in the movie that they didn't realize this was just like the whipped cream cherry on top. They had gone out and infiltrated more than 20 communities. What's different about this film compared with the IDF compilation film was that they mixed in footage with actual testimony from the survivors, and then they played video footage. So I'm going to go through my notes and describe to you what was in that movie. The movie does jump back and forth between a couple of different stories as people are explaining what happened. One of the main stories starts with the father of two kids, Maya and Itai Regev. This dad talks about how his kids, Maya and Itai, they were so excited for this supernova party that they came home from traveling abroad and they didn't even shower. They went straight to this party. There are people that talk about how this party was bigger than any of the other festivals, and it's told through the eyes of the survivors. A lot of the footage in the beginning of the film talks about kids, but well, I say kids, but they're, the party goer, like people in their 20s, the young people that went to the party. They talk about, hey, this party is really close to Gaza. They're driving close to the Gaza fence, but they were reassured that there's security. They say they know that it's near the Gaza fence, but they know that there's also kibbutzim there. People live here. They were confident in the Iron Dome. They felt secure in Israel. But one of the things that's so devastating is later in the film, they interview one of the police officers. He was one of like 3 kind of groups of officers that were sent to the south. And he says that he didn't even know that there was a party there. Just horrible, devastating. Kids from the party talked about they had this like false sense of security. They believed that they were secure. They felt confident in the Iron Dome. If anything happened, Israel has this Iron Dome system that shoots missiles out of the sky. They talked about it being crazy fun, dancing, a celebration of life. And then they got to the sunrise, which is the most anticipated moment. The sunrise and the just beautiful colors with the energy from the DJs, and that they say was like the peak of the party. They talk about how amazing it was. One man talked about his friend feeling unwell at that moment, and they took him to the side and held his hand, and then suddenly they hear these booms. When they look up, they see 80 rockets in the sky. And at first, people thought, oh, these things happen in this part of the country. They had a red alert, but red alerts happen. And then a security guard starts telling people to leave, and you can hear someone on the video saying, who has a party near Gaza? Then you see 4,000 people sitting in traffic in their cars. Terrorists on the road are screaming Allah Akbar. Some of the survivors that are interviewed talk about how they had to run from their cars because they're just like sitting there, sitting ducks, 4,000 people in a traffic jam while they're basically surrounded by terrorists. So then they had to run. This one survivor talks about seeing a woman covered in blood being carried, and then she realized that if you don't run, you're next. The terrorists got closer. Some people are shot. You need to make a tourniquet out of your clothing. This one girl talked about, I'm just reading from my notes, the terrorists are everywhere. Everyone is hiding, and you feel like burying yourself because there's like nowhere to go. But they had to run, and you heard screams. People are running and falling like next to them. And they talk about how there were 2 tractors driving alongside the group of kids running away, just shooting at the crowd of kids. One of the most poignant stories of this documentary comes from two girls who were in a porta potty stall. Now, I remember hearing that the terrorists basically went to the Supernova party and shot all the porta potties. And I had never heard that anybody lived, but these two girls apparently did live. In this documentary, they talk about how they got into a porta potty stall and got low to the ground. And they heard the terrorists basically shooting into the stalls, but they say they shot like head level and they were down on the floor. They were it was a porta potty. They described the smell, the poop, the pee, and they had to be quiet. They said they could hear the sounds from outside of the porta potty. They could see the shadow of people walking around. They could see like through the bottom crack between the door and the floor, like the shadow of the guns. And they could hear the Kalashnikovs and like shootings and bullets. And they say they didn't have the courage to open the door when the shooting stopped. Other people opened the door and got killed. And so they sat in that porta potty for 9 hours, terrified. They filmed the shadows. They filmed themselves. You could basically see it, their point of view, their perspective. And what ran through my mind is that I know a lot of people talk about the comparison to the Holocaust, but in the Holocaust, they didn't have smartphones. And every kid was basically filming a goodbye video, saying goodbye to their parents, leaving them voice messages that they love them, saying goodbye to their friends, and filming themselves monologuing to the camera as they're hiding from terrorists in the bushes or in a porta potty or wherever they were, just hoping that they get out alive. But if they don't get out alive, then their videos will make it out and people will know what happened. People were just in disbelief. One girl in the movie talks about having a panic attack. She says she couldn't run. Her legs were shaking from terror. And I don't know if it was a friend of theirs or just people that they met at the party. She says that they had a car and they were screaming to like let them in the car. She said she was holding on to the door as the car was going. And she's like, take me too. And her boyfriend was in the car and he knew that like she couldn't run. She was so terrified that like her legs were shaking. So they pulled her in through the window and they said there were like 20 people in the car. The father of Itai and Maya said that it jumps around to the different stories. That's why I'm jumping around, because I was taking notes as I was watching. He says that he heard the kids screaming. It was unclear whether it was a live phone call or they were like sending him a WhatsApp voice message, but he hears them screaming that they were shot and they love him. And then he says he got in the car and drove south. And he didn't know what he was looking for. He wanted to find his kids. He talks about how he drove south and on the way he like rescued some other kids because he had a car. He took them out and he couldn't find his children. Later in the movie, he talks about how he found a video of Hamas taking them in a truck. The word for truck in Hebrew is tender. So he says, like, I saw them in the tender, and he was half happy and half sad. I mean, obviously happy because his kid is alive, but sad because God knows what is happening to them in Gaza. Girls in the porta potty say that they didn't have the courage to leave. I wrote kids hiding in bushes. There were so many kids just hiding in bushes, hiding in trees, hiding in a porta potty, hiding under the stage, hiding. Some of those kids were murdered. Some of those kids made it out. Some of those kids were kidnapped. The police officer talks about hearing like things on the radio, and they sent 3 squads. This is what shocked me, how the policeman says none of them knew about the party. There was a group of kids that were like navigating out of the desert and the bush, and they were trying to make it out of the area, and they heard like other people in a bush, but they didn't know if those people hiding are terrorists or if they're Israelis. And kind of the leader of this group says that he saw people hiding, and I guess he took a chance because he said like, "Who are you? Are you terrorists?" And obviously, if they were terrorists, he would be dead. And the people said, "No, it's in Hebrew. We're one of you. We're one of you." And that's when another girl from the group said she realized immediately that they're at war. They talk about finding a tank and then not being able to go into the tank because one of the commanders says there are flowers in the tank, which is code for dead bodies in the tank. And so they try to get them to like hide under this tank. The women whose telling her story, says, Hamas threw a grenade at them and it was so loud that she lost her hearing and she couldn't hear anything. Hours went by and there was no army to help them. They say there was an insane number of terrorists and people died left and right. One man was dying and wanted to call his mom, but nobody had battery, and the girl that was telling it was crying. She just felt horrible that this guy had been shot, wanted to call his mom and say that he loved her, to have her hear his dying words, and everybody's phone battery was dead. Then they talked about the stories of the roadside shelters. So in Israel, they often get rockets thrown at them from Gaza. So people that live in the south, in that area near Gaza, there are a lot of roadside shelters, but these roadside shelters are made for rockets that come across. They're just kind of these like concrete shelters so that you don't get hit with a rocket on your head, but they don't have doors or anything. They're not meant for like hiding from terrorists. There were 2 or 3 roadside shelters and people just like piled into them, and the terrorists were like throwing grenades into the shelters. One woman talked about she didn't know why they threw grenades into one shelter on one side of the road, but not into another side of the road. Another guy talked about how he was in the back of the shelter and it was so claustrophobic. There were all these people, all these kids, and the terrorists threw grenades in there, and basically the way they described it, they threw the grenades in and like it exploded into body parts. The guy that was narrating his experience said that he was basically buried under body parts and he tried to reach for somebody and realized he was reaching for a leg. It was just a leg, not attached to anybody. And he was one of very few people that lived in that particular shelter. What was very evident was a couple of things. How terrifying this was. The kids were terrified. You could see it in their faces. You could see it in the way they talked. You could see it in their body as they recap their stories, and they're like crying and shaking. Also, the thing that stood out was similar to the IDF movie that I saw. There was a bearing witness movie that the IDF put out because there were so many October 7th deniers, much like Holocaust deniers, that they put out this compilation video made up of closed caption television, video from Hamas terrorists' very own GoPro cameras, similar to what we saw here, also cell phone footage, all that stuff. And there was a lot of Allah Akbaring. Okay, Allah Akbar in Arabic means God is great. Every time a terrorist either threw a grenade or shot a car or killed people, there was such glee and joy screaming Allah Akbar, and that was disturbing, I have to say. The guy that survived that grenade attack in the shelter described the smells. He said there was the smell of pee and poop and puke and burning and gunpowder and like just everything all mixed in, all these horrible smells. He also explained why he filmed everything. He said he sent these films to his dad because he wanted him to see what had happened. He wanted him to understand what was going on. And also it seems like a lot of these kids were filming themselves and filming what was going on because they knew they didn't think they were going to make it out alive, and a lot of them did not make it out alive. One common question was, how is there no army here? Why are they not arriving? They also talked about how the kids were saying they heard people saying how much they loved each other. So there was a lot of talk of I love you to each other, and calling their parents when they had cell phone battery, just leaving the messages saying that they love you, and they were basically parting from each other. It's like saying goodbye forever. A lot of them came to terms with that they might die here. There's a video of the festival on fire, which is just horrific. So Maya Anitai's dad talks about how he went to find his kids and he rescued other kids. Everything was burned, destroyed. They talk about how they went to this Garden of Eden, just gorgeous place. And anybody who's been in that area knows it's gorgeous, or was gorgeous. I haven't been there in a while. And they described it as like leaving it as hell. The dad of Maya Anitai talks about his intrusive thoughts, about how, he has these horrible thoughts of, what are his kids doing? How are they doing? How are they treating them in Gaza? And a lot of the survivor testimony talked about how even if you got out physically okay, nobody is emotionally okay. The film ends with Maya and Itai being returned. Maya is released and then Itai is released. and it kind of ends on this kind of happy ending, even though there are still hostages there. In the end, more than 370 festival goers were murdered, but the kids that are there talk about how they didn't understand the extent of the massacre. They thought that they were the main target of this massacre. They didn't realize that they were the, quote, cherry on top along the way. Because in the end, they realized that there are about 1,200 people that were murdered, 240 that are kidnapped into Gaza. And this was just a little portion of what happened that day. When you see it from this perspective, it really makes it real and really horrific. Like, it's a peaceful day, regular day. You're going to a all-night party and you think you're going to paradise, you go to hell. The burning, the murder, the gruesome rapes. Also, we talked about this after the film because then there was a panel discussion, and the director, there are two directors, and one of the survivors, she wasn't in the film, but she was a survivor from the festival, just talked about the brutality of what had happened. The woman, Millet Ben Chaim, she talks about how one of the things that is not talked about so freely and it's important to do so is the sexual violence against women. And she said that she was terrified that she would be raped. The moderator asked her, how did she know that? And Millet said that she just knew this is something that you grow up in Israel knowing this, because there are stories of anybody who's captured gets raped. They did put that video in the film of Shani, the German Israeli girl that was paraded in a truck half naked. They blurred her out. They blurred out a lot of the bodies in the film because the directors say they didn't want it to be like a gore-filled horror film. They wanted people to hear the stories. Reaction from the audience. It was so quiet. You could hear a pin drop. You could hear every little thing. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. But you did hear like quiet sobbing while people were telling their stories while, in the film. At the very end, when the film ended, there was silence. Nobody moved. Nobody got up. Nobody talked. Nobody grabbed their things. Nobody got out of their chair. The lights went on, silence. And it wasn't until the moderators started to talk that people started maybe moving a little bit in their chairs, but there was just silence. It was like people were shocked into silence, because even someone like me who had watched the IDF compilation film in November, the Bearing Witness film, it was still shocking to see the brutality. It was still just horrific. I do want to drive home some of the points that Millet made. She's the survivor that spoke to the group. And she talked about the fact that there are still hostages there that are currently being raped right now. She says there are stories coming out. There were hostages that were released that talked about how either Hamas or the Palestinian civilians that kept them hostage used them as sex slaves. And there was a 19-year-old girl that was released that was pregnant. And there's a big concern. I asked her if this was a concern, and she said, no, it's a fact that they're trying to get these girls pregnant. There's concerns about pregnancy, and it is an urgent matter that there are still hostages in Gaza. She also talked about that even if you got out of there physically okay, she's not mentally okay. She has anxiety, she has depression, she has PTSD. There's no way that anybody is getting out of this emotionally okay. It was just very, very, all the feelings, right? Sad, horrified, shocked, upset. The organizer, I talked to her later, she said that they put out the call for like anybody could come and see this film. Unfortunately, it was mostly professors, and Jewish professors. So it wasn't like anybody that is pro-Palestinian was coming to see the atrocities of what happened. And she said that she hopes that in time people will be able to, talk rationally on campus. She also talked about how just because you feel empathy for what happened on October 7th doesn't mean that you can't also feel empathy for what is happening in Gaza right now to some of the families that are caught in the crossfire. So yeah, just overall a really, really powerful film. Again, it's called Supernova, the Music Festival Massacre. It's a documentary that a lot of people are talking about. It's a reminder of if you got into your regular life and forgot how horrible October 7th was, it's a reminder that they remember it every single day in Israel. And people are living with this trauma. It was very, very, very powerful. And it was hard. It was hard to watch, but also important to see it and important to remember. The directors of the film say they were supposed to work on another documentary that started on October 8th about Benjamin Netanyahu, prime minister, and they switched gears. They were like, we have to document this and get it out there. So they say, usually a documentary like this with the research, with everything, usually takes a couple of years, and they put it out quickly in 4 months. They got these testimonies. That's what was very unique, is hearing the testimonies of people while you see the actual footage, like side by side to next to their words. Again, a difficult film and very necessary. Hopefully this will not last for long. War is horrible. And they also reminded everybody there are still hostages in Gaza. So if you do have a chance to see it, to screen it, I do recommend, if you can stomach it. For me, it felt like a necessary. To each their own. I know it's not easy to see some of this stuff. And I hope that we don't become desensitized to it. But like I said, it's important to bear witness, to know what happened, because there are some people who say that either it didn't happen or it wasn't as bad as people say. And what I can tell you is that from what I saw, it was worse. It was worse than what people say.